If you have curly hair, your DNA has been holding on to a secret that most people spend their entire lives never hearing. Not a myth, not a family rumor, an actual physical piece of ancient history coiled up inside every single strand growing out of your head right now. Curly hair is not just a style, and it is not just something you were born with in some meaningless random way. It is the result of a specific genetic architecture that took hundreds of thousands of years to build, and depending on how tight your curl pattern is, it can point back to specific ancestral populations on specific continents shaped by climate, migration, and survival. If your hair curls, coils, kinks, or even just refuses to lie flat no matter what you do to it, stay with me. Because by the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly why your hair does what it does and where that instruction came from. Think about how much time and money the entire world spends every single day trying to change this one trait. Flat irons, curling wands, keratin treatments, relaxers, perms, an entire multi-billion-dollar global industry built around either fighting a curl pattern or trying to create one that isn't naturally there. And almost none of it starts with the actual question that matters. Why does hair curl in the first place? And why does that pattern look so different depending on where your ancestors happen to come from? That question has a real answer, and it's been sitting in your genome the entire time. Let's start with something almost nobody realizes. Hair shape is not decided at the surface of your scalp. It is decided deep underneath it, inside a tiny structure called the hair follicle. And the follicle's shape is what ultimately determines whether the strand growing out of it is straight, wavy, curly, or tightly coiled. Straight hair grows out of a follicle that is almost perfectly round in cross-section, like a straw. Wavy hair grows from a follicle that's slightly oval. Curly hair grows from a follicle that is noticeably asymmetrical, flattened on one side. And the tightest, most tightly coiled hair patterns, the kind seen most often in populations with deep sub-Saharan African ancestry, grow from follicles that are dramatically flattened and even curved beneath the skin, almost shaped like a tiny hook. The more asymmetrical the follicle, the more the hair strand grows unevenly on each side as it pushes upward, and that uneven growth is exactly what forces the strand to bend, twist, and coil instead of growing straight out. Now here's the part that surprises people. That follicle shape isn't random. It's controlled by specific genes, and scientists have only really nailed down the biggest ones in the last 15 to 20 years. The most important gene in this entire story is called TCHH, short for trichohyalin. TCHH produces a protein that helps bundle and cross-link keratin fibers inside the hair shaft, essentially acting like structural cabling that holds the strand's internal architecture together. Variations in TCHH change how tightly and how evenly that cabling gets bundled, and that directly affects whether a strand grows straight or curls. Alongside TCHH, researchers have identified other genes with real influence on curl pattern, including WNT10A, which affects follicle development, and a cluster of keratin-associated protein genes that fine-tune the internal structure of the strand itself. None of these genes work completely alone. Curl pattern, like eye color, is what geneticists call polygenic, shaped by multiple genes interacting together rather than one single dominant recessive switch, which is exactly why curl patterns vary so dramatically even within the same family, and why two curly-haired parents can have a child with a completely different curl type than either of them. But there's one gene in this story that towers above all the others in terms of sheer global impact, and it has nothing to do with making hair curly. It has to do with making hair straight. The gene is called EDR, and one specific variant of it, known to researchers as the 370A variant, is one of the most dramatic examples of rapid human evolution ever documented. This variant is believed to have appeared through a single mutation in central China roughly 20 to 30,000 years ago, and unlike most mutations which spread slowly, if at all, This one spread through East Asian populations at an almost unheard-of speed, reaching extremely high frequencies, often cited above 80% in populations across China, Korea, Japan, and other parts of East Asia within a relatively short evolutionary window. The EDAR 370 variant doesn't just affect hair. It's linked to thicker hair shafts, straighter hair growth, denser sweat glands, and even subtle changes in tooth shape, all controlled by the same underlying gene, because EDAR plays a role in the development of skin, hair, and glands together during early embryonic growth. Some researchers believe the variant may have spread so fast because it offered a real survival advantage, possibly related to sweat gland density and thermoregulation in a specific ancient environment, though the full picture is still being studied. What matters for this video is the outcome. This single genetic event is a huge part of why straight hair became overwhelmingly dominant across East Asia, while curl-favoring gene variants remained far more common and far more varied everywhere else on the planet. But before we go further, here's a twist that catches almost everyone off guard, and it's exactly the kind of detail that breaks the simple version of this story wide open. If tightly coiled hair were purely a marker of recent African ancestry, you'd expect it to show up almost nowhere else on Earth in its most extreme form. And yet, on the other side of the planet, among indigenous populations of Papua New Guinea, Melanesia, and parts of Australia, some of the tightest, most tightly coiled hair textures found anywhere in the world occur naturally in populations whose ancestors split off from the lineage leading to sub-Saharan Africans tens of thousands of years ago, long before most of the migrations we've been talking about even began. Genetic studies have confirmed that the tightly curled hair found in these Pacific populations did not arrive through any recent African ancestry at all. It evolved completely independently through a separate set of genetic changes, arriving at a strikingly similar physical outcome through an entirely different evolutionary path. Scientists call this convergent evolution, and it's one of the clearest proofs that tightly coiled hair isn't some single exclusive genetic signature belonging to one lineage. It's a solution, a specific physically effective answer to specific environmental pressures, mainly intense equatorial sun exposure, that the human genome has arrived at more than once in populations separated by tens of thousands of years and thousands of miles of ocean without any direct genetic contact between them at all. Nature found the same answer twice using two completely different sets of genetic tools. Stay with me, because this is where the story really opens up, because curl pattern isn't just present or absent around the world in some flat, even way. It exists on a dramatic gradient, and that gradient maps, almost, perfectly onto deep human population history. The tightest, most tightly coiled curl patterns on Earth, the kind classified by dermatologists using a scale that runs from type 1, completely straight, through type 2 and type 3 waves and curls, all the way to type 4, the tightest coils, are found overwhelmingly in populations with deep sub-Saharan African ancestry. Populations across West Africa, Central Africa, and parts of East Africa show the highest rates of type 4 curl patterns anywhere on the planet. And this is not a coincidence of geography. It's a product of hundreds of thousands of years of evolution under intense equatorial sun. Tightly coiled hair does something that straight hair simply cannot do as effectively. It creates a dense, springy layer of insulation directly above the scalp without fully sealing off airflow, which helps protect the scalp from direct, intense solar radiation while still allowing heat to escape and sweat to evaporate. In an equatorial environment where the sun sits almost directly overhead for most of the year and heat stress is a constant survival pressure, that combination, protection plus ventilation, appears to have offered a genuine advantage over the hundreds of thousands of years that early modern humans were evolving in and around the African continent. Several researchers studying the evolution of human hair texture have proposed exactly this, That tightly curled hair may be one of the older, more deeply rooted adaptive traits in our species' history, potentially stretching back over 1 million years, tied to the same broad evolutionary as modern humans began migrating out of Africa somewhere around 60 to 70,000 years ago. They carried a wide range of hair texture variants with them, and as those migrating populations spread into new climates, new environments, and eventually mixed with other groups they encountered along the way, the frequency of different curl-related gene variants shifted region by region. Populations that settled in the Mediterranean basin across the Middle East and into South Asia developed and maintained a much broader mix of wavy and curly hair types, still showing meaningfully higher rates of curl than East Asia, but without the extremely high concentration of type 4 coiling seen in sub-Saharan Africa. Populations that pushed further east into Central and East Asia experienced that rapid EDIR 370A sweep, pushing straight hair to overwhelming dominance in a relatively short window of evolutionary time. And in the Americas, hair texture among indigenous populations largely reflects the East Asian ancestral lineage that crossed into the continent via the Bering Land Bridge, which is why straight, thick hair remains the dominant pattern across most indigenous American populations to this day. This is exactly why curl pattern, just like eye color, can act as a genuine signpost pointing back toward specific strands of your deep ancestry. If your hair is tightly coiled, that trait is tracing directly back through a lineage connected to deep sub-Saharan African ancestry, whether that connection sits close in your family tree or many generations back through population mixing across trade, routes, colonization, migration, and the long, complicated genetic blending that has shaped nearly every population on Earth. If your hair is wavy to moderately curly, you're likely Mediterranean, Middle Eastern, South Asian, or mixed ancestry populations, regions that sit in that broad genetic middle ground between the extremes. And if your hair is straight, thick, and resistant to curling, no matter what, there's a strong chance you're carrying a significant dose of that EDIR 370A variant, tracing back toward East Asian or indigenous American ancestry, even if the rest of your family history looks nothing like what you'd expect from that gene alone. It helps to actually understand the classification system dermatologists and hair scientists use, because once you know it, you'll never look at a head of hair the same way again. The system runs from type 1 through type 4, with subcategories A, B, and C marking increasing tightness within each type. Type 1 is straight hair, with no meaningful bend along the shaft at all, most common across East Asian and indigenous American populations carrying the EDAR 370A variant. Type 2 is wavy hair, forming a loose S-shape, common across parts of Europe and mixed ancestry populations. Type 3 is properly curly, forming tighter, well-defined spirals. And Type 4 is the tightest classification, covering coily and kinky, patterns that range from tight corkscrews down to a dense, springy zigzag pattern with almost no visible curl definition at all in its tightest form, 4C. That entire spectrum from 1A completely straight to 4C tightly coiled exists within a single species, all controlled by variations in the same small handful of genes, expressed differently depending on which ancestral populations contributed to a person's specific genetic mix. It's one continuous biological spectrum, not a set of separate categories, and most people alive today carry some blend of variants from more than one point along it. That blending shows up in fascinating ways once you start looking at specific regions instead of entire continents. South Asia is a perfect example, and it's one that matters directly for this channel's audience. Hair texture across South Asia is genuinely diverse, ranging from straighter patterns more common in parts of the north, where ancestry connects more heavily to steppe and Central Asian migrations, to noticeably curlier and wavier patterns common across large parts of southern India, Sri Lanka, and among populations with deeper ancestral roots tracing back to South Asia's earliest inhabitants, sometimes referred to in population genetics research as ancient, ancestral South Indian lineages, predating the later arrival of steppe-related ancestry into the subcontinent. The same pattern shows up across the Middle East and North Africa, where you'll find everything from tight ringlet curls to loose waves to straight hair within the same country, sometimes within the same extended family. A direct genetic reflection of thousands of years of population, movement, trade, and mixing across one of the most crossed regions on the planet. Curl pattern doesn't respect national borders. It reflects genetic history, and genetic history rarely lines up neatly with the map. Twin studies have actually put a real number on how much of this is genetic versus environmental, and the number is higher than most people expect. Research comparing identical twins, who share essentially all of their DNA, against fraternal twins, who share roughly half, has estimated the heritability of hair curl pattern at somewhere around 80 to 90%. That means the vast majority of what determines whether your hair is straight, wavy, curly, or coiled is locked in by your genes before you're even born, with humidity, hair care products, and styling only ever working around the edges of a pattern your DNA already decided. Every wash day routine, every product, every technique people spend years perfecting is, in a very real sense, working in cooperation with a genetic blueprint written tens of thousands of years before shampoo ever existed. Here's something that trips a lot of people up, and it deserves a direct answer, because comment sections under videos like this, one always fill up with the same confused question. How can someone have straight-haired parents and curly hair themselves, or the other way around? The answer, again, comes back to the fact that curl pattern is polygenic. Because so many different genes are involved, each contributing a small piece of the final outcome, curl pattern can hide in a family's DNA for generations, carried silently by parents and grandparents whose own hair looks nothing like it, only to reassert itself suddenly and unexpectedly in a child. A straight-haired parent can absolutely carry hidden curl-associated variants inherited from a grandparent or great-grandparent, invisible in their own hair, but very much present in their DNA, waiting for the right combination to line up in the next generation. This is one of the most common sources of family confusion and even outright suspicion throughout history. And it is almost always nothing more than ordinary recessive genetics quietly doing exactly what it's designed to do. There's also a persistent myth worth shutting down directly, the same way we had to shut one down in the green eyes video. The idea that hair texture says anything at all about a person's character, discipline, or personality. It doesn't. Historically, curly and coiled hair textures have been subjected to an enormous amount of social bias, treated in many cultures and time periods as something to be straightened, hidden, or corrected, while straight hair was elevated as a beauty standard, often tied directly to colonial-era power structures and the specific populations that happened to dominate media and fashion industries for the last century. None of that reflects biology. It reflects history, politics, and marketing, layered on top of a trait that is, at its core, simply a follicle shape shaped by a small handful of interacting genes. The genetics don't carry any of that baggage. People did. Something else worth knowing. Hair texture isn't always fixed for life the way people assume. Because curl pattern is influenced by hormonal changes and because gene expression can shift subtly during major life stages like puberty, pregnancy, and aging, it's genuinely common for a person's curl pattern to change meaningfully over their lifetime. Plenty of people are born with loose, wavy hair as infants, only to develop noticeably tighter curls by adolescence as hormone levels shift and follicle development continues. Others notice their curl pattern loosening with age or changing texture entirely after pregnancy, driven by real measurable shifts in hormone levels interacting with the same underlying genetic machinery. Your curl pattern isn't a single fixed sentence written once at birth. It's closer to an ongoing conversation between your genes and your body's changing biochemistry across your entire life. Now here's where ancient DNA turns this from theory into something you can actually verify. Unlike some traits, hair itself doesn't preserve well enough in most ancient remains to visually confirm texture directly, but the genetic variants responsible for curl pattern, including markers around TCHH and the EDAR gene region, absolutely do survive in ancient DNA extracted from skeletal remains. Researchers studying ancient genomes recovered from sites across Africa, the Middle East, Europe, and East Asia have been able to track the frequency of these specific variants across tens of thousands of years, building an actual genetic timeline of how hair texture-related genes shifted in different populations, as migration, mixing, and local adaptation reshaped the human genome region by region. The EDAR sweep across East Asia is one of the best documented rapid selection events in the entire field of human population. Think about the sheer scale of what's coiled into every single strand on your head. A follicle shape, sculpted over hundreds of thousands of years of evolution under specific climate pressures. A set of genes, including TCHH and a cluster of keratin-associated proteins, quietly working together every time a new strand pushes up out of your scalp. A history of migration that carried those genes out of Africa, across the Middle East, into South Asia, into Europe, and for one specific C straight hair variant, through an evolutionary sprint across East Asia so fast that geneticists still study it as one of the clearest examples of rapid natural selection in our entire species. None of that is visible when you look in the mirror. All you see is the outcome. But underneath that outcome sits an unbroken genetic record, stretching back further than written history, further than agriculture, further than almost anything humans have ever built. Let's actually put numbers to this, because curly hair is common in some places and rare in others. Doesn't mean much until you see the real gap. In parts of West and Central Africa, tightly coiled type 4 hair patterns are close to universal, present in the overwhelming majority of the population. Across the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and South Asia, wavy to curly patterns, types 2 and 3, show up in a substantial share of the population, frequently cited in regional studies as affecting somewhere between a third and half of people in specific communities, though exact numbers vary widely by study and region. Meanwhile, across East Asia, straight type 1 hair dominates overwhelmingly, driven by that EDAR sweep, with curl-favoring variants sitting at comparatively low frequency. None of these numbers exist in isolation. Every single one of them is a direct fingerprint of a specific ancient migration, a specific climate pressure, and in at least one documented case, a single mutation event that reshaped an entire continent's hair texture within an evolutionary blink of an eye. If any of this makes you want real answers instead of guesses, this is exactly what modern DNA testing is built for. Autosomal testing today can flag your specific variants around TCHH, the keratin-associated protein cluster, and the EDAR region, and compare them against reference populations pulled from both living communities and ancient burial sites, building a real, evidence-based picture of which ancestral populations most likely handed you your specific curl pattern. For some people, that confirms exactly what family stories already suggested. For others, it uncovers a completely unexpected thread woven into a family tree that nobody had ever traced that far back. Either way, it turns a lifetime of "why is my hair like this" into an actual documented answer. There's a piece of this migration story that almost never gets told, and it happens entirely within Africa itself, long before anyone left the continent. One of the largest, best documented population movements in all of human history is known as the Bantu expansion, a slow but massive spread of Bantu-speaking farming communities out of a homeland near the border of modern Nigeria and Cameroon, beginning roughly 3,000 to 5,000 years ago, and eventually reaching all the way down to southern Africa over the following millennia. As Bantu-speaking populations expanded south and east, they carried their language, their agricultural knowledge, and their genetics into regions previously home to different, older populations, including ancestors of groups like the San and Ko peoples of southern Africa, who carry some of the deepest and most ancient genetic lineages of any humans alive today. This internal African migration is part of why curl pattern, even within sub-Saharan Africa, isn't perfectly uniform, and why population geneticists studying hair texture-associated genes on the African continent still find meaningful regional variation layered underneath the broader, near-universal presence of tightly coiled type 4 hair. Africa isn't one genetic block. It's the most genetically diverse continent on Earth, home to more deep-rooted human genetic variation than every other continent combined. And that diversity shows up in hair texture, too, in ways most people outside the field never hear about. Now stay with me, because there's a cultural chapter to this story that's just as important as the biology, and it stretches across thousands of years in a completely different direction. Long before genetics existed as a science, curl pattern was already loaded with meaning in nearly every society that encountered it. In ancient Egypt, elaborate. Braided and curled wig styles signaled status and rank, worn by pharaohs and elites regardless of their natural hair texture underneath. Across many West and Central African societies for centuries, specific braid patterns and styling techniques carried real, coded information, communicating a person's tribe, age, marital status, wealth, or even religious beliefs, a kind of visual language written directly into curl and coil. Colonial-era power structures later inverted almost all of that meaning, actively suppressing traditional hairstyles and pushing straightened hair as the acceptable standard across large parts of the world. An imposed hierarchy that had nothing to do with biology and everything to do with control. That history didn't disappear with independence or civil rights movements. It's part of why hair texture remains such a loaded emotional topic for so many people today, and understanding the actual genetics underneath it, hundreds of thousands of years of evolution, specific genes, specific follicle shapes, strips away every bit of that imposed hierarchy and replaces it with something much simpler and much more powerful. The truth that every single curl pattern on Earth is the product of deep, ancient, entirely neutral biology, none of it better or worse than any other. It's also worth understanding why curly and coiled hair behave so differently day to day compared to straight hair, because this connects directly back to the same follicle geometry driving the entire story. Natural oils produced at the scalp travel down the hair shaft far more easily on straight hair because there are no bends or twists to interrupt the path. On curly and coiled hair, every bend in the strand acts as a small obstacle, making it significantly harder for those same natural oils to travel the full length of the hair. That's a direct physical consequence of follicle shape, the same asymmetrical structure responsible for the curl itself, and it's the real reason curly and coiled hair types are generally more prone to dryness and require fundamentally different care routines than straight hair. This isn't a separate mystery. It's the same genetic story, just showing up in a completely different everyday way. So the next time somebody calls your curls just genetics, you'll know exactly how much history that phrase is quietly carrying. A follicle bent by hundreds of thousands of years of sun, a protein doing structural work you'll never see, a migration map written into keratin. Your hair has been telling this story since before your family had a name for it, and now, finally, you know how to read it. Take a second and actually think about what that means for your own head of hair, whatever pattern it happens to be. If it's tightly coiled, you're carrying one of two possible ancient stories, either a direct genetic line back to Sub-Saharan Africa, the birthplace of every human being who has ever lived, or, in far rarer cases, an entirely separate evolutionary path that arrived at the same solution independently on the other side of the world. If it's straight, you're very likely carrying the genetic echo of one of the fastest, most dramatic selection events ever documented in human history, a single mutation that swept across an entire continent in a fraction of the time most genetic changes take to spread even locally. And if you're somewhere in the middle, wavy, loosely curled, a mix that seems to shift depending on the weather or the season, you're carrying a genetic blend shaped by thousands of years of migration, contact, and mixing between populations who, at some point, crossed paths, intermarried, and combined their DNA into exactly the pattern sitting on your head right now. None of it is random. Every strand is a decision your ancestors' genes made for reasons that made complete sense in the world they were living in, long before anyone alive today existed to ask why. Comment below and tell me your curl type, and tell me what you now think it's connected to, because I guarantee half of you are about to be surprised. Subscribe, because next time we're cracking open another trait hiding a full migration story inside your DNA, and it's just as wild as this one.